warmth for the day. In a not very spacious room, Chris Edison stood in front of a girl sprawled in a chair. His interlocutor, in a demanding tone, literally ordered him to withdraw several $100,000 more from his account, since her brother needed a new car. During this meeting, the man wanted to show the piece of paper he had in his pocket. But as soon as he heard the girl's words, his hand remained in his pocket. Looking up at his interlocutor, Chris calmly informed her that he had no more money left. This statement made Chloe jump up from the chair she had been so comfortably seated in, and shout a reminder that the man should have already received his salary. Showing incredible impudence, the girl approached her interlocutor, starting to feel and turn out his pockets. And when she really didn't find anything there, she immediately gave Chris a hard slap in the face. He didn't respond to this gesture, and Chloe continued to demand money from him, expressing the assumption that he was simply hiding it from her. At some point, Chris chuckled, saying that again all the questions were only about money. These words provoked a new reaction from the selfish girl, who grabbed a glass of water, splashing her interlocutor. Chloe was incredibly irritated by the fact that, despite the lack of money and such a difficult situation, this man was still laughing. But he clearly didn't care what she thought of him. He just repeated what she had said to him about him being just a loser without money. And then Chris seemed to break down, where he began to scream hysterically about how all these years he had paid for everything that her family wanted, including the house, his brother's wedding, where even if he earned $100 million, it would not be enough for her family. After this, Chloe began to reproach her husband that this was his family too, and therefore he should not be so selfish, but was obliged to show concern for the family. The girl's statement that her relatives and his family too greatly amused the man again. And when he shouted that he was fed up with her insatiable relatives, Chloe grinned and said that in that case he might as well throw himself out of the window.
It's time for Rhonda. It's time for Rhonda. It's time for Rhonda. It's time for Rhonda.
Her interlocutor seemed to be moved by these words, noting that she was wrong to think about his lack of courage to take such a step. But the girl did not back down, asking her husband to wait a little with his death until she took out the appropriate insurance for him, so that she could at least get something out of it. Looking at his interlocutor intently and with obvious hatred in his eyes, Chris said that she was an incredibly selfish woman, after which he turned to face the window. The stunned girl didn't even have time to say anything when her husband was already starting his last run in this life. His body was rapidly falling down, followed by a piece of paper that had fallen out of his pocket, which turned out to be a doctor's report diagnosing him with cancer. While Chris's thoughts were only about how lousy his life had ended, the young man standing in the room suddenly dropped to his knees, greatly surprising everyone standing opposite him. The woman sitting on the couch asked Chris what had made his legs buckle so much, and a certain young man, grinning maliciously, declared that it was probably their family tradition to fall on their knees upon entering. The guy himself couldn't understand what was happening, because just a second ago he was rapidly approaching the asphalt. But now he has confirmed that he still feels alive. Hearing this, the woman asked the guy to stop making faces and playing some kind of incomprehensible comedy. Raising his gaze after this remark and seeing the woman, the young man called her mom in surprise. But she immediately calmed his ardor, saying that he must add another $400,000 to the bride price, and only after that would he have the right to call her mom. Chris was incredibly surprised when he heard the demand for a bride price, barely holding back the emotions that surged through him. He instantly realized that he had gone back several years in time, to the day he had asked for Chloe's hand. Well, the future mother-in-law continued to insist that in order to receive a blessing from his parents, he had to add another $400,000. Slowly rising to his feet, Chris began to talk about how he had had time to think things through. After all, in his past life, his decision to marry Chloe influenced his entire subsequent life, leading to the most unpleasant consequences for him. The mother-in-law's eyes were already burning with greed, and she kept repeating that he had given them another $400,000 in exchange for a blessing, since the guy had a chance to start all over again and not repeat the mistakes of his past life. He immediately shouted that he did not agree to these conditions. Of course, his refusal to pay sent this selfish family into a real rage. When asked by his failed mother-in-law this time, Chris noted that if she was hard of hearing, he would repeat that he would not pay a penny for this bride. Here the would-be bride and wife began to be indignant, asking the guy how he could have done such a thing to her. And Chris asked a counter-question, asking whether they wanted to marry her off or just sell her, asking him for a total of $1 million. When the girl emphasized that her parents had spent money to raise her, the young man noted that for this money, he would also get her loser brother. The guy who had just recently been making fun of Chris for falling to his knees immediately jumped up, demanding an explanation as to who he had decided to call a loser. And Chris repeated that he called the worthless person who was now standing in front of him and trying to be indignant a loser. This was the last straw for Steve, and he lashed out at his sister's possible future husband. But the young man had no intention of hitting the guy back and arguing with him, as in his past life. Having failed this attack, Chris deftly and quickly laid the attacker on the floor, only hearing behind his back the demands of his relatives to let the guy go. When someone stated that Steve was a member of his family, the young man said that he was not yet married to Chloe and was not part of their family. Nevertheless, he let go of the guy lying on the floor, straightened up, and declared that from that moment on, he wanted nothing to do with their family. The last attempts to keep the groom were made by Chloe, who desperately declared that their relationship and love could not be worth this measly million. Looking sideways at the girl, Chris noted that she had no idea how hard it was for people to get money, where in his past life he was lucky that his father won $500,000 in the lottery. As he was leaving the apartment, the young man noticed that the Quincy family was looking for a cash cow, and he was not at all interested in them. The first thing Chris did, having the relevant information, was go to the place where lottery tickets were sold. The grand prize was $100 million, where his father missed only one number for the grand prize, which imprinted the winning combination in the boy's memory. And now he was already thanking the seller for the only lottery ticket he had bought. As he was about to leave, the young man turned around and noticed his father heading in the same direction. As he approached, the man noticed that he seemed to see the outline of his son's body, who should now be in the Quincy family, making an offer. The young man managed to hide, watching his father buy the very lottery ticket that won $500,000. The boy only thought about how his dad probably denied himself a lot in order to save up for the lottery, through which he hoped to help his son. As he left the ticket office, the old man prayed out loud that he would be lucky enough to win this time. Looking away, Chris mentally promised that from today on, he would not let his parents suffer. At that moment, a message appeared before his eyes, where a certain system welcomed the new user, giving instructions to receive $100 million within 24 hours, as well as the enterprise into ownership. The amazed young man also read that the number of his life points was equal to 1, and if he failed to complete the task, death awaited him. Already approaching his house, the young man did not believe that he had just been reborn, but he again had less than a day left to live. Chris's thoughts were interrupted by a woman's scream demanding that someone take their hands off, and the young man immediately recognized the voice of Christy Atwood. Without thinking for a second, the young man rushed towards where the girl's voice was coming from. In his past life, he and Christy had been friends since early childhood, and she became like a sister to him. But her mother lost $500,000 in mahjong, and Christy had to live with him for a while. He was with the Quincy family that day and was unable to come to their aid when the creditors slaughtered the entire family. And now the two thugs to whom this girl's mother owed money were preparing to commit their crimes. The villain didn't even have time to realize that Chris appeared next to him, and with one blow threw him aside, right at his accomplice standing next to him. A tearful Christy immediately asked to be embraced by her dear savior, who asked if everything was okay with her. Meanwhile, the attacker became enraged, hissing that no one dared touch him with their hands, much less hit him. The girl got scared when she noticed how the second villain was about to attack her friend from behind. But Chris somehow managed to turn around and grab the attacker's hand, causing him some unpleasant sensations. Meanwhile, the one who was pestering the girl pulled out a knife, saying that now the one who interfered in their affairs would answer for everything. At that moment, the young man let go of the villain's hand and said that if they killed him and the girl, they would definitely not see any money. And so the unarmed bandit also began to say that their boss would be happier if they brought him money, rather than a couple of corpses from which there was nothing to take. When the guy with the knife asked Chris if he had $500,000, he asked for just 3 days, after which the creditor would receive his money. Having agreed to these conditions, the villain demanded that the guy additionally pay for treatment and also add $100,000 in compensation for moral damages. But at the same time, he warned Chris about what would happen if the money did not appear within 3 days, where all debts will be paid off in kind by this cute, pretty girl. To this, the young man firmly stated that in 3 days the money would be there, and the guys would have to beg for forgiveness on their knees. Finally, the villain shouted that their boss would break his legs if Chris dared to cheat and not pay. Here, the system window appeared before the young man's eyes again, containing a hint that in order to complete it, the young man needed to pay attention to a construction company called Building Group. While Chris was remembering that this company had gone bankrupt in his past life, Christy was apologizing for dragging her friend into her problems. After patting his adopted sister on the head, the young man told her not to worry about anything and to return home to rest. And suddenly the guy felt how his body suddenly began to weaken sharply and his eyes darkened. Chris grabbed his head, which was spinning incredibly hard, and the girl tried to find out what was happening to her friend, whose face was very distorted. But then the young man staggered and began to fall forward, right into the place where his interlocutor stood. A moment later, the girl was lying on the floor, feeling the body of the guy on her, whom she continued to inquire about his state of health. Looking at the girl who was deeply blushing, Chris apologized, explaining his weakness by the fact that he hadn't eaten anything for almost a day. Looking at his palm, where the symbol of attachment to the system was located, the young man mentally noted that the messages were not a joke, and the system completely controlled his life. Meanwhile, the Quincy family was trying to understand what had suddenly happened with Chris's behavior, who was now not even answering Chloe's calls. When the mother asked whether her daughter had managed to contact her fiancé, she answered negatively. The father tried to pounce on his wayward daughter, who couldn't even hold back such a simpleton, but the mother stood up for her, drawing her husband's attention to the fact that Chris was not himself today. After thinking about everything that the guy had always been like an obedient puppy to Chloe. But today, something had gone wrong. And then Chris's entire failed family was struck by the brilliant idea that the guy could simply suddenly become rich. After this, the man demanded that his daughter take active action, where she must use any means and methods to keep and return this guy. His wife was in complete agreement with her husband, telling her daughter to start acting immediately before Chris was taken away by another woman. Obeying her parents' will, the girl went to carry out the assignment, wondering why Chris had hidden something from her, something he had never done before. The young man himself, in the company of Christy, returned home, where he sat her down at the table and offered her some fresh fruit. When the doorbell rang, the girl rose from her seat, saying that she would open it herself. Chris's adopted sister greeted her beloved brother's girlfriend with all the kindness in her voice, but before she had time to enter inside, she immediately demanded an explanation from the guy regarding everything he had done today. But the young man said that he and Chloe no longer had anything in common, and therefore there was absolutely nothing for her to do in his apartment. Without letting her say a word, the young man assumed that it was her parents who couldn't calm down and had sent her here. The girl decided to resort to accusations that Chris was either dating someone else or was simply afraid of the large ransom. Exhaling heavily, the young man said that she was wrong, that everything was simply over between them. He also recommended that Chloe leave her parents' house as soon as possible, and only then would she be able to give herself a chance at a normal life. Realizing that the conversation had failed, the girl headed out of the apartment, saying at the end that the guy would regret his decision. The one who was most surprised was Christy, who knew that her adopted brother and Chloe were a couple and were going to get married. Without answering the question about what happened between them, the young man said that it was time for him to go and warned that he might not return soon. The first thing the young man did was go to where the lottery was being held and prizes were being given out to the winners, and he noticed his father there. The man has already commented on how he will spend his winnings, stating that he simply wants his son to be happy. Chris, however, acted smarter and received the prize long before the crowd of journalists had gathered there, now quietly leaving the place. While scrolling through the news about the building group company being threatened with bankruptcy, the young man remembered the system's hint that he needed to direct his attention specifically to this company. Having some information about the future, Chris knew that whoever bought this company would definitely not lose out in the future, and so now he had the opportunity to become the richest man in this city in a few years. The decision to start building his own business with this was made by the young man quite quickly. By morning, the young man arrived at the location of the building group office, surprised that there was such a large crowd of people there. Suddenly, he felt a strong pain in the area of his heart, and a system message appeared reminding the guy that he had only an hour left before the expiration of the set period. Here his attention was drawn to two men who were carrying some kind of poster, demanding that he give way to them. In response to Chris's question, one of the workers explained that they were on strike because the company had been delaying their wages for a long time, and his comrade added that one of the company's founders had disappeared altogether, while the second was saddled with an unimaginable amount of debt. The guy was already happy, and the man continued, saying that now everyone was expecting the second founder, Ethan Barbach, to appear here. Having thanked them for the valuable information they had provided, the young man headed straight into the thick of the strikers. Having made his way through the crowd with difficulty, Chris soon found himself next to a car, the movement of which was blocked by workers. Inside the car sat Ethan Barbach and his bodyguard Blake Keith, who had less than flattering things to say about this gathering of workers. When he suggested hiring people to suppress the unrest by force, Ethan noted that he did not want any unnecessary casualties. Blake practically jumped in surprise when he saw Chris's face in the window in front of him, who caught the attention of the passengers with a light knock on the glass. Meanwhile, the system relentlessly sent messages that the guy had only 25 minutes left. Without wasting any time, the young man somehow made his way into the salon, to the amazement of the company owner's bodyguard. Ignoring the guard, Chris introduced himself to Ethan, saying that he had urgent business with him. The guy's behavior made the man lose his temper, and now he was shouting for the young man to immediately leave the car. But then Chris said that it was up to him now whether Mr. Barbuck would go to prison for a long time or not. And then Ethan started talking, saying that he was already trying to find a solution and pay the workers, and therefore blackmail was useless, since there really was no money. The man was shocked when this strange guy suddenly said that he did not come to ask for money, but to offer it. And so Chris announced that he would help pay off all the wage arrears, and would also buy out the company and become its full owner and director. Casting an extremely distrustful glance at the guy, Ethan began to say that he had no idea how much all this would cost him, but the young man insisted, demanding that he specify the amount. As soon as he said this, a system message immediately appeared before his eyes, informing him that there were only 10 minutes left until the end of the set time. Putting his glasses back on, the man said that if the guy doesn't have at least 50 million, he shouldn't even think about becoming the owner of the company. However, the young man was not at all embarrassed by the amount named by his interlocutor, which would have seemed simply cosmic to anyone. Thinking that Chris was just making fun of him, Ethan suddenly became enraged, shouting for his bodyguard to throw the insolent man out of the car. Blake immediately set about carrying out his boss's orders. But to his great surprise, the young man turned out to be stronger and more agile, and now he was pressing the fighter to the back of the seat, depriving him of the opportunity for free movement. Watching the guy's actions, Ethan mentally noted that from his appearance, one could not tell that he was rich and so well trained. Blake tried to break free and resist, but at some point the head of building group stopped him. After which the man asked the young man for forgiveness for the way he was treated, explaining it by a whole bunch of problems that had fallen on his head. And now Chris has once again declared that he is ready to solve all of his interlocutor's problems, even if, as he put it, it really does cost 50 million. Ethan couldn't believe the reality of the proposal, almost begging the guy to stop his jokes. But he, with a completely serious expression on his face, said that there was no talk of any jokes here, and he continued to insist that the man announce the final price. Meanwhile, the inexorable system announced to the user that he had 5 minutes of life left. Now both men who were with him in the salon could not believe the seriousness of his words. When the system announced that the user had 3 minutes left, and that all 5 of his senses would now begin to switch off, the young man hurried Ethan with an answer as best he could. And finally, he announced that if the young man found 20 million right now, he was ready to make a deal. But Chris no longer heard what was said, since his hearing, as one of his senses, had already managed to switch off. From the movements of his lips, he guessed that we were talking about 20 million, and asked to proceed with the transaction immediately. Ethan asked his bodyguard to organize the formalities, and he immediately began to do so. When the contract was handed into Chris's hands, he didn't know how to sign it, because now his vision was starting to fade, and the system was counting down the last 10 seconds. The young man had only 6 seconds left to live when a money transfer terminal ended up in his hands. As soon as the device screen showed that the transaction was successful, the countdown stopped, stopping at 3 seconds. Throwing his head back in relief, the young man mentally noted that the system had not received any messages about the time being up, which meant that he had made it in time. And then an announcement appeared in front of him that he had successfully completed the test task, for which he received 13 life points. Reading the information that 1 point is spent per day on life, and also that you can buy a lot of things in the system store with points, the young man was in 7th heaven, realizing that his life goes on. At some point, a brick suddenly flew into the car window, and shouts were heard from the street that the second head of the company could not be allowed to escape like the first, otherwise they would definitely not see any money. Turning to his boss, Blake asked what they should do next with this clearly escalating situation. Not knowing what to do, Ethan turned to the guy sitting next to him, who now had quite a lot of rights in this company. Thinking that his body was slowly but surely returning to normal, the young man said that the man now had money, which meant he could pay the strikers their wages. Taking the advice, Ethan ordered his bodyguard to go out to the people and announced that everyone would receive their paychecks that evening. A few seconds later, Blake announced over the loudspeaker that everyone would be getting their money tonight, and so they had better all leave. The workers found it hard to believe, but nevertheless the announcement was encouraging, and so they decided to believe it and end the strike. Once the strike was over, Ethan said that they needed to stop by the company's office to bring Chris up to speed on things. After some time, the young man carefully studied everything that the man presented to him. Armed with a red marker, Chris marked the plots of land on which nothing needed to be built yet, as well as those plots of land that needed to be purchased for the company's ownership. Noticing one of the circles, Ethan noted that no one was buying this piece of land because it was very remote and no one wanted it for free. But the guy had information about what would appear there in the future and how land prices would change. And so he asked Ethan to simply do as he said. Continuing his thought, Chris said that as soon as the company acquires this site, it is necessary to immediately build a shopping center, restaurants, and other establishments that people like to visit for recreation and shopping. The young man also instructed to organize everything so that the buildings looked modern and stylish, where the emphasis should also be on quality. When Ethan assured Chris that he would do everything exactly as he instructed, the young man added that if the man listened to him, then together they would reach unprecedented heights.